Alright, so this is going to be a review video for Exam 1. So I have the study guide pulled up here for you guys, and Exam 1 is going to pretty much stick with these topics. There may be a few questions on something else, but the majority of the questions will come from the study guide, or from the topics on the study guide. So Exam 1 is going to be 50 questions. There's going to be 35 multiple choice, 10 true false, and 5 matching. Also keep in mind that there are going to be 2 opinion questions. So the last 2 multiple choice questions are always opinion questions, where as long as you mark an answer, you'll receive credit for that. Now, one thing is that I haven't yet figured out on Canvas how to set it where you get credit for it regardless of what answer you put. So what I'm going to do is go in and add those points for those questions after everyone does the exam. Okay, so you'll see your grade will actually go up a little bit after everyone turns in the exams, so that I can give you those points for those opinion questions. Okay, if you have any questions about the setup for the test, let me know. Remember that you'll have 75 minutes to take it, and that you need to complete it in 1 session. Okay. So starting off with research methods, we talked about different types of research, starting with observational research here, where you're basically just observing people and getting ideas and making notes. And so observational research, the goal here is to describe behavior. And so you're not going to be able to determine causation with this kind of research, but it can give us some ideas that we could then translate into experimental research later. And so the goal here is really to describe and to understand the types of observational research. There are several. Mostly we talk about things like, well, one thing we did talk about in this class, I think, was the archival research, where you could actually go and look at records. But there are several other types, doing things like case studies, or doing things like, making observations, watching people, kind of naturalistic observations. So there are several types. Great things about observational research is that, as I said, it does give you a lot of great ideas, and it can give you a lot of good information. I mean, if you're doing naturalistic observation, you can see the way that people behave in the real world in their natural environment. But the problem with observational research is going to be that if people know that you're observing them, then it will change the way they behave, right? We call that reactivity. In other words, they are likely to change their behavior one way or the other if they know that they're being observed. Also, another drawback of observational research is, as I said, we can't determine causation here. Interjudge reliability is the same thing as inter-rater reliability. It's the idea that if we are having people observing and making notes, then it's really best to have more than one person, because one person might be biased or might make mistakes, and that way we would never know if there was something wrong with the recording unless we had multiple people doing it. So with inter-rater reliability, you have at least 2 people who are making observations, and then you see how consistent their observations are or how much they agree with each other. Correlational research, the goal here is to predict. And so once again, we still cannot determine causation here, but we can have a prediction. So like, for example, with ice cream sales and violent crime, right? We've heard that there is a strong correlation there, so I can use the ice cream sales to predict violent crime. I can use violent crime to predict ice cream sales. That doesn't mean that I can say that one causes the other, I just know that they go together, right? So with a correlation, we're just saying that we have at least 2 variables that tend to go together. Now, we're talking about the strength and the direction here. We're talking about the number and the sign that you see in the correlational coefficient, right? So starting off with the strength is just all about the number, right? So when we're talking about the strength, a correlation that is strong will be one that is closer to 1.00. Remembering that 1.00 is a perfect correlation, 0 is no correlation. And so the stronger the correlation, the higher the number. And so, for example, a 0.8 correlation is stronger than a 0.4, or 0.9 is stronger than a 0.6, right? So you're going to look for the number to tell you the strength. You don't need to look at the direction, just the number, right? Now, the direction is going to tell you whether or not it's positive or negative. So positive correlation means that 2 things go together in the same direction. Negative correlations mean they go in opposite directions, okay? And so when you're looking at the strength, you should only look at the number and not the direction. So for example, a negative 0.5 correlation and a positive 0.5 correlation have the same strength, right? Because we're looking at the number, okay? Now, drawbacks with correlational research, as we said, we cannot determine causation yet with this kind of research. Also, it could be misleading, right? We talk about the research with the ice cream sales and the violent crime, If you tell people that, people might start to think that there's a causational factor there, which we don't know when we do correlational research. We have to do other kinds, and so sometimes correlations can mislead people. Okay. So then if we do want to determine causation, and we do, then we're going to need to do experiments. So experiments are going to be much more complicated than any of the other kinds of research, but they're necessary if we want to determine causation. So starting off talking about experiments, the goal here is to determine causation, to know why something happened. And so what we're going to do is first we're going to identify our population, all the people that we're interested in. But we can't get everyone to be in our study, so we're going to have to take a sample. Now the best sample will be a random sample that then will be more likely to be representative of the population, or in other words, more likely to look like the population, or to have the results from the sample apply to the population. So you identify your population and then you take a random sample. Once you have your random sample, you have all of your participants for your study. So then you're going to randomly assign your sample into the different groups. Now, it could be much more complicated than this, but a simple idea of a research study would be having one experimental group and one control group, where half of your participants are randomly assigned in the experimental group and half are randomly assigned into the control group. Now, we only want one thing to be different between our experimental group and our control group, and that is our independent variable, the thing that we manipulate. We want everything else to be the same. And so that's really where random sampling and random assignment come in. All of those little individual differences will hopefully be randomly assigned into the two groups so that there's nothing that makes one group substantially different from the other group, right? So we want the only difference to be the independent variable, the thing that we manipulate, the thing that we change, the way that we make the experimental group different from the control group, right? Typically, the experimental group gets something new, some kind of treatment, or some kind of, maybe as we talked about, aggression. They get exposed to something that might increase aggression, whereas the control group gets nothing. They get a placebo, they get a documentary about puppies. I mean, it's not related to the study, but it's because we need someone to compare our experimental group to, right? So the independent variable is the thing that we manipulate, and the dependent variable is the thing that we measure. So the dependent variable is our outcome. It's what we're really interested in the study. Now, if we do a good job with our experiments, then we can say that we can determine causation. The problem here is that it is very difficult to do good experimental research, and so we have to think about reliability and validity. We talked about reliability a little bit when I talked about inter-judge or inter-rater reliability, but that's really all about making sure that our research is consistent. And consistency is very important, but we also have to think about validity. So validity is accuracy. Validity in general is accuracy. Internal validity is going to be making sure that we tightly control as much as we can so that there's only difference between the experimental group and the control group is what we manipulated. In other words, we want to make sure that any change in the dependent variable is caused by the independent variable, the thing that we're manipulating. We don't want anything else to be messing with our dependent variable, because if it is, then we don't know how much of the effect came from our independent variable and how much came from other variables, right? So ways to improve internal validity: tightly controlling for things. So do your research in a lab. Try to make sure that the groups are equal. You can do a pretest on something to make sure the groups are equal. And then also doing that random assignment is very, very important, and random sampling as well. All right, external validity, on the other hand, is making sure that our results apply to other people outside of our sample. So we said that our population are all the individuals we're interested in. Our sample is a very small subsection of that. We want to make sure that our results from our sample apply to our population as well. And so to do that, then we're going to need to, once again, random sampling and random assignment, and that's important, and that helps with everything. That's just good, high-quality research, although it's hard to do when you think about doing it on a large scale. So that's important, but other ways to increase external validity would be to kind of let go of some of that control, because we said that if we want our results to apply, then we don't want to do anything different in our group or in our sample, different from the population. And so bringing them into a lab and tightly controlling everything is something different, something that most people in the population are not getting. And so doing our research out in the real world can help with external validity. But as we talked about, there's always a balancing act between internal and external validity. As far as ethics go, doing good ethical research is extremely important. One of the hallmarks of ethical research is having good informed consent, meaning that participants understand enough about the research study to be able to say whether or not they want to participate. And so it always has to be optional. And so with informed consent, you want to tell them about the benefits of the study and the drawbacks of the study. You want to tell them about the procedures you're going to use and how you're going to benefit society with your results, and how they can contact someone if they have questions. And so all these things are important. Now, to make sure that we are doing good ethical research, we have something called an IRB, right? Institutional Review Board, looking over our shoulder, making sure that we're not doing anything unethical to our participants. However, this can get complicated when we talk about deception, and in social psychology we do deception a lot, where we don't necessarily tell the individual the exact purposes of our study, because if we did, it would basically ruin our results. And deception can be ethical, as long as you are taking those extra steps. If your participants can't necessarily judge for themselves whether or not they want to participate because they don't know the true purpose or the true procedures, then you have to be very careful making sure that you have designed an ethical study. And this is where the IRB comes in, making sure that you do that. But it is certainly possible to have ethical research involving deception. Okay? And the IRB does approve that sometimes. Alright, so the next lecture is about communication, and so we talked a lot about nonverbal behavior. We talked about how that's anything that's not the words that we say. So nonverbal behavior can include our eye contact. It can include the use of touch. It can include facial expressions or body posture. There's so many different things that it could include here. And the function of nonverbal behavior, there's several, right? You can express an attitude towards someone. You can tell them something about who you are and about your personality. You can send a lot of cues here. A lot of times our nonverbal behavior and our verbal behavior don't line up with each other. And I have just kind of found that when that's the case, often the nonverbal behavior is the one that tells you the most, right? Difficulties in decoding them, it's sometimes difficult because we can be expressing several different emotions at once. We can be feeling several different emotions at once, and so then it can be difficult to read. Also, sometimes people try to hide their nonverbal behavior. They try to mask it, like they don't want you to see what they're really thinking. And there are also cultural differences in this as well, and so it's going to be easier to read the nonverbal behavior of someone who's within your own culture, and especially someone that you spend a lot of time with. You kind of learn how to pick up on their nonverbal cues, right? Are they universal? It depends. Typically, we talk about the 6 major emotions that we'll talk about in a second, that the facial expressions tend to be fairly universal. So, like, for example, with the 6 major emotions, these are, happiness and sadness and fear, like the ones that we did in our activity. And so when we're talking about those facial expressions, they're expressed pretty much the same across all cultures. When we're talking about other kinds of nonverbal behavior, though, they're less universal, right? So we talked about how some symbols that we use don't necessarily mean the same thing in other places, about how different cultures have different ideas about the way we should make eye contact and the way we should use touch. And so the facial expressions of those major emotions tend to be the same. But some of those other nonverbal cues are different in different cultures, right? So I discussed the 6 major emotions as well, and these are the ones that are basically present from birth. And so individuals are going to develop these first, and the emotions that develop later are going to be those self-conscious emotions, like, for example, embarrassment and pride and guilt and shame. And so you really have to kind of understand having a self-concept, or realizing that other people have thoughts about you and other people have expectations for you. You have to understand that before you can feel those emotions, right? So those are going to develop later in life. Mirror neurons are just special neurons that fire both when we see someone do something as well as when we do something. And so it is our basis of being able to feel empathy here and being able to put ourselves in other people's shoes, right? Display rules are all about how we show emotion and what is okay in our culture. And so they're basically cultural norms or social norms about the way that we express emotion. And so we talk about some examples here. There are different display rules for men and women in our culture where we're sort of okay with women being more emotional. We're used to that. We're comfortable with that. Men being more emotional tends to be a little bit more taboo in our culture, although I think that's changed some. Also in other cultures, like they may not express their emotions as much. We tend to express more than other cultures. And so a display rule is just saying what is appropriate when it comes to showing emotion. All right, attribution theory is all about us figuring out why. Why do these things happen? So when we have attributions, we can make internal or external attributions. So if an attribution is just our explanation of the situation, then an internal explanation or an internal attribution is this person did that because of who they are, because of something about their personality or something about them. An external attribution would be this person did that because of the situation they're in, and it seems like most people in a similar situation would do a similar thing, right? So we talked about the way that the attributions play a role in our marital happiness, that healthy marriages or happy marriages tend to make internal attributions for those good things. So, wow, you're such a great person, versus the external attributions for negative things like, wow, I see that you're stressed out, I see that you're tired. And we said that maybe perhaps that pattern of attribution leads to happy marriages, or maybe it is that happy marriages are more likely to use them. So there's a correlation there. We don't know causation unless we do a research study. And it would be difficult to do a research study here to manipulate that, because some people wouldn't have those attributions even if you told them to. But so you're going to see the opposite effect or the opposite pattern in unhealthy marriages or just unhealthy relationships in general. And then the fundamental attribution error is the idea that everyone's behavior is caused by who they are. And so we tend to, especially in our culture, focus more on people and focus on who they are internally. And so we tend to make this error a lot, where we don't take into account the situation. And so perhaps we misjudge people either in a positive way or negative way because we make this attribution error. So we say this person did a good thing because they're a good person. Well, maybe they did, but maybe they did it because they're trying to get something. On the other hand, we say this person is a bad person because they did a bad thing. Well, maybe they are a bad person, or maybe they were in a difficult situation. And so fundamental attribution error is that we don't always take into account the situation. So with a two-step process of attribution, the first thing you're going to do is make an internal attribution. Now this is true for all of us, including individuals in collectivistic cultures. And we'll talk more about that in a second. But especially in our culture, we tend to make that first internal attribution and stop. We don't always go on to that second step. So we say that, okay, that behavior is because of who they are, and then we go on about our way. It is possible, though, to go to that second step and make an external attribution and take into account the situation. Now, when does that second step happen? Well, sometimes if we feel very motivated to get the right answer, this can happen. Sometimes if we perhaps understand that person's situation, like we can see the situation, we know the person well, we're very motivated to have a good relationship here, or maybe if we're suspicious, like we think that they're lying to us or we think that there's something else going on, then we might pay more attention to the environment as well. So we don't always go to that second step, but one thing that determines whether or not we do is our culture. So individualistic cultures are cultures that tend to focus on individuals, like our culture. So Western cultures, including our culture, tend to be more individualistic, where we focus on our own achievements and goals and dreams, and we feel like we are individuals. Versus a collectivist culture that would say that the most important thing is your relationships with other people, and you would define yourself based on the success of your relationships. And so then in that case, with a collectivist culture, they're more likely to make an external attribution. Why? Because it makes relationships easier if you try to understand people's situations and if you cut them some slack whenever they do something negative. And of course, making relationships easier is going to be more important in a collectivistic culture that values relationships, right? A few other types of attributions. We talked about self-serving attributions, which is just the idea that we make an internal attribution for good things and an external attribution for bad things. And this is a way to try to maintain our self-esteem so that we feel pretty good about ourselves. So if I make a good grade, that's because I studied. If I made a bad grade, it's because my roommate distracted me or something like that. Or the teacher doesn't like me, or it was cold in the room, or it was hot in the room, or whatever the case may be. We say we were distracted. So then we have this self-serving attribution where we try to maintain our self-esteem. There's nothing wrong with self-serving attributions. In fact, we find that people who don't have them are depressed. or maybe it's the people who are depressed don't have them. So once again, we don't know causation here, but there's a relationship. But the self-serving attributions can become a problem if we don't take credit for the negative things. We may never change them and make things better, right? The belief in a just world is a defensive attribution and internal attribution. So we said that a defensive attribution is a way of explaining something or an idea about something that we feel like protects us. And so the belief in a just world is the idea that people get what they deserve and they deserve what they get. So then if someone gets something good, they must be a good person, and if something bad happens, they must be a bad person. This is an internal attribution because we're talking about whether or not someone is a good person or a bad person. That's internal, right? And we do this, and the advantages here are that it allows us to deal with things that, we feel like we can protect ourselves. We hear about bad things happening every day on the news. You can't check MSN without seeing terrible things happening in the world. And we need to have a way to make ourselves feel better, a way to make ourselves feel like we can prevent these things. It's not necessarily accurate, but it makes us feel better. On the other hand, though, the disadvantage is that if you truly believe this, and you believe that people get what they deserve, it can lead to people blaming the victim, right? Sometimes bad things happen, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. And yet we can sometimes shift the blame to the victim because we want to try to feel like it won't ever happen to us. And so that can make us very callous individuals, and so we need to avoid that at all possible. And then one last kind of attribution is the misattribution of arousal. This is just we said an attribution is an explanation. It's an answer to the question why. A misattribution of arousal would be misunderstanding why we feel the way we feel. So we have that like sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, arousal, our heart's racing, blood pressure's up, or whatever the case may be. We look to the situation, the people around us, to see why we're feeling that way. And so one example that we talked about in class or in the lecture video was about having an attractive woman come and meet men on a rickety bridge that's very high up in the air. And if she came and gave them her number while they were on the bridge, they were much more likely to call her later than if she came and gave them her number like after they had rested and finished crossing the bridge. And the idea was because while they were still on their bridge, they were having that fight or flight, heart racing. And when they see this woman, they assume that it's her that must be causing that emotion or that feeling. And so sometimes we make mistakes when we're trying to identify why we feel the way that we feel. So then if you really want to impress someone, you should take them to a horror movie on a first date or ride roller coasters or something like that. But that's all of my relationship advice. And then the last couple topics, the self-concept is just the idea that we are something unique, that we are something different from other people, and it develops in early childhood. The slides, I think, said around the age of 2, but it's going to be a little bit different for each individual. How does it change as a child gets older? Well, as the child ages and matures, their self-concept will become more abstract, right? And so it will be less about the concrete characteristics of what they look like or where they live or the name of their pet or something like that. It'll be more about like what other people think about them and their personality traits. And so some of these things are identity that's not so easily seen, right? Gender stereotypes, we talked about. A stereotype in general is just a judgment or an idea that you have about someone based on their group membership, even if you don't know them. And so a gender stereotype, more specifically, is something that we believe about an individual, and we see them based on their gender. We think that they must fit into this category, right? And they develop because, in a large part, because of our culture, right? Because we have social norms for men and women, and so then we expect people to conform to those norms, and we teach our children they need to conform to those norms, right? We said that men and women are actually fairly similar, that maybe they feel the same things and they experience the same things, but they express them in different ways. But one way we did say that men and women were different was the relational interdependence versus collective interdependence, which is just a way of saying that women tend to value one-on-one relationships specifically. So maybe romantic relationships or best friend kind of thing, whereas men tend to focus more on collective interdependence or group membership, right? So making sure they're part of a team or part of a fraternity or part of a group at work. something like that. Now, all of these things are just generalizations, right? They don't necessarily apply to each individual. Impression management is one way that we control the way that other people look at us, and so the way that they see ourselves. So impression management is universal. The way that we do it might depend on the group. And so in our culture, we might do it differently than other people do it, but we definitely, in all cultures, people try to manage their impression. And so there we talked about several different types of impression management. Ingratiation, so you're kind of sucking up to people. Self-handicapping is also a type of impression management. So with self-handicapping, we are worried that we would be blamed for something if something bad happened, and so we kind of have these built-in excuses, right? Now this can be like actual self-handicapping, like staying out all night drinking the night before a test, where then if you know that you're not going to do well on the test, you can say, well, I would have done well except I was out all night drinking, and so you have an excuse. Or it could just be reported self-handicapping, where you tell everyone you were out drinking even if you weren't. That way, if you don't do well on the test, you have a built-in excuse, right? Narcissism is the idea that people have very, very high opinions of themselves and love themselves quite a bit, and that's okay, but the problem is that someone who's narcissistic also lacks empathy, meaning that they can't take other people's perspectives. And if they can't understand other people's perspectives, then it will be very difficult for them to have proper relationships. And so the mythology behind the name is about Narcissus, who fell in love with his reflection when he saw it and actually ended up dying because he refused to stop looking in the pool, looking in his reflection. And so there is a lesson there that it is important to care about ourselves, but it's also important to care about others as well. And then the last little bit about motivation. So we talked about how motivation in general is what drives our behavior, what leads us to do things. If we didn't have motivation, then we wouldn't do anything. Intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation is really about why we're doing what we're doing. With an intrinsic motivation, we're doing it because we want to, because we love it. We would do it even if we weren't getting paid. We would do it even if there was not an external reward. And so maybe there's a hobby that you enjoy, something that you like doing that you do just because you enjoy it. And I hope for you guys, this is college, I hope that you have at least some classes that intrinsically motivate you. On the other hand, the extrinsic motivation is a motivation that is coming from somewhere else. So it could be that you're motivated to do it to get a paycheck. It could be that you're motivated to do it to get a grade or to please other people, but it's a motivation coming from outside of yourself, right? So it's kind of extrinsic, it's kind of external motivation. Now, there's nothing wrong with extrinsic motivation. There are a lot of things that we wouldn't do if we didn't have extrinsic motivation, but we do want to make sure that we have some intrinsic motivation as well. We talked about the danger of reward programs, and that kind of leads into the over-justification effect, but the over-justification effect is the idea that if there is a large extrinsic reward available, then if you ask people why they're doing what they're doing, they tend to say they're doing it to get the reward, rather than they're doing it because they enjoy doing it. And so if we're worried that if we give large rewards, for example, we talked about to kids for reading, if we give them excessive rewards, they might feel like, oh, well, I'm only doing this to get the reward, versus if we give smaller rewards and more appropriate rewards, then they say, okay, well, the reward was nice, but also I enjoyed the reading as well. This is why we're talking about the over-justification effect. This is why individuals tend to enjoy things less after they are getting paid for them. So, for example, someone who had a hobby that was previously doing it just because they liked it, they maybe turn it into a business, or they go professional in some way and start getting paid for it. They tend to enjoy it less, right? So ways to preserve intrinsic motivation. We want to make sure that we are giving people choices. So when we're talking about reading programs, let the kids pick the books they want to read, and they'll maintain intrinsic motivation for reading because they'll be more likely to enjoy the process of reading regardless of whether or not they get a reward. So giving people individual choice, also giving appropriate rewards. So rewards that are based on performance, not just based on whether or not you did completed the behavior, but how well you did the behavior. And also giving people an opportunity to do things that they enjoy doing without large rewards, right? So we talked about how if the reward is too large, then that can undermine our motivation, our intrinsic motivation. Okay. So that is all of the material. So if you have any questions, then please let me know. So also, in addition to this review video, there is going to be a practice exam that will be available for you that you can take for extra credit, but also to see what kinds of questions will be on the test. So just let me know if you need anything. Otherwise, you guys have a great day.